Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into something that usually makes us, well, pretty uncomfortable: the unknown. Our society is absolutely obsessed with answers, with data, with making sure every single blank is filled in. But what if we've been looking at this entirely the wrong way? Right out of the gate, I want you to consider that what you don't know isn't a flaw in your intelligence or some sort of bug in the human experience. It's actually a profound, totally necessary feature. So, here's a massive question to kick things off. What if the things we don't know are actually more important than the things we do? It's a pretty provocative thought, isn't it? We literally spend our entire lives trying to stamp out ignorance. Yet the source material we're digging into today suggests something wild. It suggests that the spaces where our knowledge simply runs out, the gaps in our understanding, might actually be the most vital spaces of all. We're going to look at how different philosophical and spiritual traditions treat these gaps, not as scary, empty voids, but as spaces bursting with sheer potential. Usually, when we hit a blank spot in our knowledge, we see it as an intellectual weakness. You're probably familiar with the God of the Gaps fallacy, right? That's where people just use a divine placeholder to casually plug a hole in scientific or logical understanding. It's generally seen as a pretty weak argument. But we're exploring a total paradigm shift today, a shift that views the gap as radical humility. Instead of just being a limitation, the unknown suddenly becomes the absolute engine of our intellectual and existential pursuit. It forces us to admit our limits, which is exactly what propels us forward. Let's start breaking this down with Section 1, the mind, rethinking the unknown gap. Honestly, there's no better place to start than with Socrates. I know that I know nothing. In philosophy, recognizing the gap, all that stuff currently sitting outside our verified, logically deduced systems, is the exact equivalent of this famous Socratic realization. It is radical intellectual humility. Now, Socrates wasn't saying he was foolish. He was pointing out that true wisdom begins precisely at the boundary of what we know. The gap isn't the finish line, it's the starting line. And this beautifully sets up a concept called aporia. Now, that might sound like a dense metaphysical term, but at its core, aporia is just a state of perplexity or contradiction where no clear solution exists. It's a productive impasse. Think of it as a really fruitful roadblock. This gap, this aporia, prevents us from achieving total closure. It stops us from kicking our feet up and saying, well, we figured it all out, nothing left to do. Instead, it keeps the philosophical conversation alive. It forces us to keep questioning, keep digging, and keep debating. Think about it. If everything were known, philosophy would literally just cease to exist. The gap isn't just some missing puzzle piece. It is the perpetual wellspring of thought itself. The ultimate mystery is what actually keeps us searching. Without the unknown, our minds would basically go dormant. The gap is the oxygen keeping the fire of human curiosity burning. Moving right along to Section 2, the boundary of logic, negative theology. This brings us to an absolutely fascinating tradition known as negative theology, or via negativa. This is the practice of defining ultimate reality, or the divine, strictly by what it is not. Many ancient traditions totally recognize that human language is way too limited to describe ultimate reality. So instead of trying to name the unnameable, they use the gap. The gap perfectly aligns with this negative definition. It perfectly represents the inexpressible. The gap is the exact boundary where human reason falters and transcendence begins. Negative theology basically tells us that conventional logic can only carry us so far. Actually, scratch that. Logic carries us exactly to the edge, and then something infinitely greater, something that can't be put into a neat little box, takes over. The very failure of our reason becomes the doorway to transcendence. We see this articulated so brilliantly in Martin Heidegger's concept of being or sign. He asks the big one: why is there something rather than nothing? It is the ultimate inexplicable fact. This gap represents a foundational mystery. Science is incredibly good at describing the how of the universe, how particles interact, how stars form, but it cannot truly explain the why. Why does anything exist at all? That is the ultimate gap sitting right at the edge of scientific explanation, just waiting for us to ponder it. Let's shift gears a bit. Section 3, the spirit, the void in meditation. In spiritual terms, this gap is often called the void. To use everyday language for a pretty complex metaphysical idea, the void is just an internal gap you create by stopping your racing thoughts and letting go of your attachment to fixed concepts. It's the active process of clearing out the mental clutter. In mysticism, true spiritual experience rarely happens when your ego-driven mind is being noisy. It happens when you intentionally create emptiness. And what's truly wild is how universal this pursuit is. Creating this internal gap is a cornerstone across totally different traditions. In Buddhism, it's known as sunyata, or emptiness. In Christian contemplation, it's kenosis, which is the emptying of the self. In Sufism, you find similar practices aimed at quieting the ego to experience the divine. All these paths figured out the exact same thing. This deliberate gap in our constant stream of consciousness is the necessary condition for mystical union. But hey, entering this gap is not easy. It requires what the source material calls a leap of faith, surrendering completely to the unknown and the unverified. It takes immense trust to let go of our desperate need for control and comprehension. This reverence for the gap is really a deep reverence for the boundless potential that lies just beyond our grasp. You basically have to be willing to leap into the mystery. Which brings us to the big so what? Section 4, the application, transformation through the unknown. To actually apply this, we first have to totally flip our worldview. If you view the universe as a static, finished product, then a gap is just a missing piece, like an error in the code. But if you view the universe as an ongoing, active creation, then the gaps change completely. They become active sites of creation. They are the exact construction zones where new knowledge, new life, and new consciousness are continually emerging. So, how do we navigate this in our own lives? Step 1 is to actually experience that internal gap. This might show up as undeveloped potential or maybe a full-blown existential crisis. Step 2 is honestly the hardest. Sit with the holy mystery. When we feel that internal gap, our knee-jerk reaction is to plug it immediately, right? We want a quick fix, so we turn to mindless consumerism or rigid dogma or constant distraction. The absolute key here is to resist that urge. Finally, step 3 is to allow meaning to emerge. By trusting the uncomfortable tension of the unknown, you allow the gap to literally become a catalyst for your own personal and spiritual growth. The ultimate source of wonder, of philosophical vitality, and of deep spiritual experience is not actually found in the answers we already possess. It's found in the vast, humbling, sacred questions that we cannot yet answer. Sitting with the unknown doesn't lead to existential dread. It leads to an endless unfolding of wonder. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. What meaning might emerge if you stopped trying to fill all the gaps and simply sat with the mystery? The next time you hit a wall, a moment of deep uncertainty, or an unanswerable question, instead of rushing around to find a quick solution, try just resting in that space. Let the unknown be exactly what it is. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and more importantly, keep making space for the mysteries.